From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
They haven't had showers in 10 days. They've only had one change of clothes in those 10 days. And there are porta potties on the unit. However, they're being told that they're for correctional officers only, that they can't use them, and those are overflowing.
As the massive Hurricane Irma races towards southern Florida, we go to Houston, Texas, to look at what happens to prisoners who are left to fend for their lives in flooded jails. Then, NFL star Michael Bennett speaks out after being taken down and assaulted by police in Las Vegas. He says one officer threatened to, quote, blow my effing head off.
There's a lot of people who experience what I experienced at that point, at that moment, and they're not here to live to tell their story. I think about, Trayvon Martin. I think about Shirley Lyles. I think about Phil Castile, Tamir Rice. So many different people that had the experience that I had, and they're not here to tell their story. So that's what it is.
Then we look at segregation in Alabama.
In the name of the greatest people that have ever trod this earth, I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
That was Alabama Governor George Wallace in 1963. We'll speak to New York Times Magazine reporter Nicole Hannah-Jones about how segregation is returning to Alabama's public schools. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Hurricane Irma, the most powerful Atlantic storm ever recorded, laid waste to parts of the Caribbean overnight, pummeling Turks and Caicos, hammering the Bahamas, and taking aim at South Florida, home to millions of residents. The storm's death toll rose to 18, but officials warn that figure will increase as rescue workers search through the rubble of islands that have seen over 90% of all buildings destroyed. Irma weakened slightly as it pushed west and was downgraded Friday from Category 5 to 4 storm, but it remains extremely dangerous with sustained winds of 155 miles per hour. The storm lashed the northern Dominican Republic on Thursday, flooded parts of Haiti overnight, but Irma's eye passed well north of Hispaniola, sparing the two countries from the worst of the hurricane's wrath. In South Florida, freeways jammed with cars Thursday and Friday as officials ordered the evacuation of more than 500,000 people, one of the largest evacuations in state history. Irma's eye is projected to strike South Florida early Sunday morning as a Category 4 storm, delivering storm surges of 10 feet or higher. In Miami Beach, which averages 3 feet above sea level, Mayor Philip Levine told a local CBS reporter Irma's an existential threat.
We've talked to people in your city who say, we ain't going.
Well, I hate to hear that. And I'm going to do everything in my power to convince them that this is a very serious storm. This is a nuclear hurricane. They should leave the beach. They must leave the beach.
The National Weather Service warns of likely structural damage to even sturdy buildings, with the complete destruction of mobile homes likely. Elsewhere, Florida Power and Light said Thursday it's shutting down a pair of nuclear power plants ahead of the storm. The twin-reactor Turkey Point plant, which is 20 feet above sea level, lies just south of Miami on the coast, directly in the path of Irma's expected landfall. Further north on Florida's Atlantic coast is the twin-reactor St. Lucie nuclear plant. In order to avoid meltdowns, both plants must maintain constant power to ensure the cooling off of nuclear fuel rods in their reactors, as well as highly radioactive spent fuel rods kept in storage pools on site. Meanwhile, forecasters warned Hurricane Katia could strengthen in the warm waters of the western Gulf of Mexico into a major hurricane before it makes landfall in the Mexican state of Veracruz, south of flood-ravaged Texas, which is still reeling from mass flooding after Harvey's landfall less than 2 weeks ago. And in the eastern Caribbean, Hurricane Jose is threatening to bring fierce winds and a storm surge to the island of Barbuda, which Hurricane Irma damaged 95% of the island's buildings after it hit on Tuesday. The unprecedented hurricanes come as a study finds climate change is driving the mass extinction of parasites that are critical to natural ecosystems and could add to the planet's sixth great mass extinction event that's currently underway. The report in the journal Science Advances warns about a third of all parasite species could go extinct by 2070 due to human activity. The loss of species of lice, fleas and worms could have profound ripple effects on the environment and might pave the way for new parasites to colonize humans and other animals with disastrous health outcomes. In Texas, 7 emergency workers are suing the Arkema chemical company after they were exposed to toxic chemicals and hospitalized after an explosion at a plant outside Houston that was flooded by waters from Hurricane Harvey. At least 2 tons of volatile chemicals known as organic peroxides burned after cooling systems at the plant failed. Attorneys say the first responders were never told about the dangers of the resulting chemical plume, which FEMA Director Brock Long later called incredibly dangerous. The Arkema plant is in Crosby, Texas. To see our toxic tour of the Petro Metro, you can go to DemocracyNow.org. In Mexico, the strongest earthquake in a century struck off the West Coast early Friday, leveling buildings in the impoverished states of Chiapas and Oaxaca and triggering tsunami warnings across the Pacific. The quake struck at a shallow depth of just 43 miles, making it particularly dangerous. There were early reports of at least 15 deaths, but that toll is expected to rise dramatically after the U.S. Geological Survey warned of mass casualties and said the disaster is likely widespread. The quake triggered Pacific Ocean tsunami sensors, but Mexican President Enrique Peña Nieto later said the waves were not as high as feared and major damage from tsunamis is unlikely. The quake is so powerful it rattled buildings, broke windows, and knocked out power in parts of Mexico City, more than 450 miles away. Syria's government's accusing Israel of bombing a military scientific research center in the west of Syria that Israeli officials accuse of producing chemical weapons and missiles that could be used to deliver them. Syria's government said the attack could bring dangerous repercussions to the security and stability of the region. The Israeli airstrikes came a day after UN investigators concluded Syria's Air Force used the nerve gas sarin in an attack in April that killed at least 83 people in the rebel-held town of Khan Sheikhoun. The UN said it was one of at least 20 chemical weapons attacks by the Syrian government during the conflict. President Trump welcomed Kuwait's Emir, Sabah al-Jamal al-Jaber al-Sabah, to the White House on Thursday, saying he was prepared to help mediate a dispute the Gulf Kingdom and its allies have with Qatar, which Trump has accused of supporting terrorism. President Trump also praised Kuwait's monarch for purchasing U.S.-made weapons, including warplanes.
Kuwait has purchased a tremendous amount of military equipment and other equipment, many 777s from Boeing, a lot of F-18s from us. We're going to be talking about additional orders and military orders.
Kuwait is a member of the Saudi-led military coalition that's been bombing Yemen since March of 2015. This week, the UN said the airstrikes were responsible for most of the 1,100 killed during the war, calling the ongoing famine and cholera epidemic in Yemen an entirely man-made catastrophe. Doctors Without Borders warned Thursday migrants rescued at sea while attempting to cross the Mediterranean from North Africa should be allowed to seek asylum in Europe rather than be returned to Libya, where they face sexual violence, torture, and forced labor. The humanitarian group's president, Dr. Joanne Liu, said in an open letter Thursday, European Union authorities are feeding a criminal system of abuse by returning migrants to Libya.
So today, we are making a public appeal, sending this open letter to governments in Europe, asking leaders to publicly position themselves on what is happening in Libya today. Are they okay with containing and sending people back to where they would be raped, tortured, and enslaved?
The warning by Doctors Without Borders came a day after the European Court of Justice struck down a legal challenge brought by Hungary and Slovakia over the European Union's mandatory refugee quota policy, which orders national governments to take in their fair share of asylum seekers. Back in the U.S., a federal court struck another blow Thursday to President Trump's ban on refugees and visitors from 6 majority Muslim nations. The unanimous ruling by 3 judges on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals rejected an attempt by the Trump administration to deny visas to grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins who wish to travel from the affected countries to join relatives living in the U.S. The Justice Department said it'll challenge the latest ruling on the travel ban when the Supreme Court hears the case next month. In healthcare news, Massachusetts Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren said Thursday she'll co-sponsor a bill by Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders that would expand Medicare to include every American. The measure, which Sanders is expected to introduce later this month, would provide universal health care by lowering the age of Medicare eligibility from 65 to 0. Other Democratic senators, including California's Kamala Harris and Montana's John Tester, have said they might support the bill. In West Virginia, prosecutors have dropped charges against journalist Dan Heyman of Public News Service, who was arrested in May while questioning Health and Human Services Secretary Tom Price. Heyman's arrest inside the West Virginia state capitol came as he pressed Price about whether domestic violence would be categorized as a pre-existing condition under the Republicans' proposed health care bill. Heyman was charged with willful disruption of state government processes. He told reporters he was relieved after Thursday's decision to drop charges, saying, quote, "Facing 6 months of jail time for asking a question as a journalist was pretty troubling." Education Secretary Betsy DeVos said Thursday the Trump administration will roll back rules aimed at protecting survivors of sexual assault on college campuses. The move reverses President Obama's 2011 directive on Title IX, the federal law that prohibits sex-based discrimination at schools. Speaking in Arlington, Virginia, DeVos said the changes were denying due process rights to those accused of rape and sexual misconduct on campus.
Through intimidation and coercion, the failed system has clearly pushed schools to overreach. With the heavy hand of Washington tipping the balance of her scale, the sad reality is that Lady Justice is not blind on campuses today.
The Education Secretary Betsy DeVos's comments drew protests from survivors of campus sexual assault who rallied outside the building at George Mason University, where DeVos delivered her remarks. This is Sophie Karasek of the group EROC, that's End Rape on Campus.
What she's trying to do is to tip the scales in favor of perpetrators, and that she's siding with rapists. That's what she decided to do today. And we, as survivors and students and as allies, we're not going to stand for that. And we will not go back to the days when all you were getting for committing rape was either nothing or a $20 fine and an essay assignment.
In privacy news, the credit reporting agency Equifax said on Thursday a software vulnerability left personal information for 143 million people exposed to hackers in one of the largest data breaches in U.S. history. Equifax said the information included Social Security numbers, driver's license information, credit card numbers, and other data. Bloomberg reports just days after learning of the breach, 3 top Equifax executives sold about $1.8 million worth of Equifax stock, yet it waited over a month to inform the public. Equifax's share price plummeted overnight after news of the data breach broke, losing nearly 15% of its value. And in the Philippines, President Rodrigo Duterte's son, Paulo, told Senate investigators Thursday he played no part in a scheme to ship more than $125 million in illegal drugs from China.
My presence here is for the Filipino people and to my fellow Dabaweños to whom I serve. I am very sorry. Og pasayluha ko ninyo. But I cannot answer allegations based on hearsay.
Paulo Duterte and President Duterte's son-in-law, Manassas Carpio, face allegations they helped arrange for the shipments of crystal methamphetamine last May. Since President Duterte launched a so-called war on drugs in the Philippines last year, security forces and vigilantes have killed more than 7,000 suspected drug dealers and users. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As the National Football League begins its new season, one of its most outspoken players has revealed he was recently detained and assaulted by police in Las Vegas. Seattle Seahawks star Michael Bennett issued a statement on Twitter Wednesday, writing an officer threatened to, quote, blow my effing head off, and that, quote, Las Vegas police officers singled me out and pointed their guns at me for doing nothing more than simply being a black man in the wrong place at the wrong time, unquote. The incident took place outside a boxing match last month in Las Vegas while police were responding to reported gunshots. Video released by TMZ shows Michael Bennett on the ground being handcuffed. Listen closely.
I wasn't doing nothing, man. You asked me a question. I was here with my friends. They told us to get out. Everybody ran. Did you ask me a question, sir? Okay, man. Just hands together.
On Wednesday, Michael Bennett held a news conference to talk about what happened.
Obviously, I would hate to be up here through these circumstances, to happen to be up here talking about it. It's a traumatic experience for me, my family, and it sucks that the country that we live in now, sometimes you get profiled for the color of your skin, and it's a tough situation for me. There's a lot of people who experience what I experienced at that moment, and they're not here to live to tell their story. I think about, Trayvon Martin. I think about Shirley Lyles. I think about Phil Castile, Tamir Rice. So many different people that had the experience that I had, and they're not here to tell the story. So, so that's what it is. I'm just lucky to be here to be able to speak about it. At any moment, I could have made the wrong decision and whether move. I felt like I was resistant or doing something wrong, and you guys would be wearing, the Seahawks would be wearing the patch with number 72 on it. So I'm just lucky to be here right now and to be able to continuously fight for people, fight for the equality of all people, regardless of their color, regardless of their gender, regardless of all that. I'm just going to continuously do what I've been doing. It's a hard journey. Sometimes you feel like you're alone, but there's a lot of people who support me, and I just want to keep doing what I do. At this point, it's the reality of what I live in every day. I think a lot of people, as a black man, you fear sometimes what could happen to you, the possibilities if you're in the wrong situation at the wrong time, and you hope and you wish that everything that Martin Luther King said or the people before me, we hope that you be judged on the content of your character, not the color of your skin, but sometimes you get judged on that, and that's the reality that I live in. It's this when people ask why I sit down, and this is why. This is the things that I go through, what people go through that look like me, or people that's going through something differently. That's Seattle's Seahawks NFL star Michael Bennett. The Las Vegas Police Union has accused Bennett of making false accusations against the officers. Bennett has a long record of speaking out against racial and social injustice. He's joined a protest movement led by former 49ers quarterback Colin Kaepernick against racial injustice, sitting on the sidelines during the playing of the national anthem ahead of Seahawks games. For more, we go to Washington, where we're joined by Dave Zirin, sports editor for The Nation magazine, also the host of Edge of Sports. Zirin's working on a book with Michael Bennett about his life, Things That Make White People Uncomfortable. Welcome, Dave, to Democracy Now! So explain exactly when you understand this happened. I think you talked to Michael Bennett that night. This was at the famous boxing match that took place in Las Vegas?
Yes, it was the Saturday before last, the famous Floyd Mayweather-Conor McGregor match in Las Vegas. And I received phone calls from friends of Michael Bennett and texts from Michael saying what happened immediately. And what happened sounded just incredibly traumatic. And I really want to say something to Democracy Now! Listeners. People have to understand that Michael Bennett, as you so beautifully laid out, Amy, he's one of us. I mean, he has the soul of an activist. He has stood with people from Seattle to Houston to the Gaza Strip to Haiti. He's given his time. He's given his money. And what he described to me that night was so frightening. And all I could think to myself as I'm hearing this story about him having a gun against his head, police officers saying they were going to blow his effing head off, him speaking about like his daughters and whether he would ever be able to hug his wife again or kiss his daughters. But
can you explain what happened after the match? Why hundreds of people started running?
Yes, there were reports inside a casino called Drace, right on the Las Vegas Strip, of gunshots. And people started yelling, gunshots, gunshots, guns, guns. And there was loud noises. There was a scuffle of some kind. Hundreds of people ran out onto the Strip. Statues were toppled over, just to give you an idea of the chaos. And Michael was one of the people who was running out, trying to find somewhere safe to go because of gunshots. And what it looks like what happened, what Michael described to me happened, is that police honed in on him as somebody who could possibly be a suspect in what may have happened. And they took him to the ground. They handcuffed him. They put a knee on his back, which is very scary because if a knee is on your back and you move, that can also look like you're resisting arrest. And then, as photographs clearly show, a weapon was unholstered by the police and put by his head. And what's so disturbing about this police union letter that you referenced by the Las Vegas Police Union is that they say they're putting out this letter to refute what Michael Bennett said in his own letter about what police did, but they don't refute any of those facts. The gun against his head, the threat to blow his head off, they don't refute any of that. Instead, what the police union wrote, and I mean, this is so disturbing to me, is that in the first paragraph they write, while the NFL may condone Bennett's disrespect for our American flag and everything it symbolizes, we hope the league will not ignore Bennett's false accusations against our police officers. So think about what they're doing here. They're calling upon the NFL to investigate Michael Bennett for telling the truth about what we see on tape of what happened. And they're saying basically that, well, maybe he deserved it because of his stance about the flag. That is so frightening to think that the police would put forward the statement that one's personal politics justifies brutality.
I wanted to turn to Michael Bennett's brother. They're both football stars. Martellus Bennett was with the Patriots. Now he's with the Green Bay Packers. This is what he said.
Today, someone sent me the video. I didn't even know that there was a video, and I had to walk out of the meeting because I broke down crying just thinking about, like, what could have happened.
So, Dave Zirin, what happens now?
Well, there's some very interesting developments at work. First and foremost, the National Football League and Roger Goodell has already put forward a statement saying that they stand with Michael Bennett in this, and they describe him as one of the people in the league who they really are proud of because of the community work that he does, which is epic and legion from Seattle to Houston. I got to tell you, Amy, like, one of the reasons why Michael didn't come forward the week right after this took place is because Michael Bennett is from Houston, so he immediately was getting to work to raise money for victims of the hurricane. I mean, that was why the week layoff before he came forward with this. I mean, that's just the kind of person that he is. And so I think the NFL has already announced that they would not be investigating Michael Bennett for false statements against the Las Vegas police. Michael Bennett's team is thinking about ways that they can stand with him. And a week from this Sunday, I'll tell you this right now, which is the home opener for the Seattle Seahawks, there's going to be a rally that's held in front of the Seattle Seahawks Stadium that's going to be put on by the Seattle branch of the NAACP that is about standing with former 49ers quarterback Colin Kaepernick. That's why it was originally called, but now it's turned into a solidarity rally for Michael Bennett to let him know that he will not be alone in this process as he goes forward with a lawsuit, and really to send the message that Las Vegas police may have victimized Michael Bennett, but he is somebody who refuses to be a victim in this case, and they really picked on the wrong big black man outside a melee in Las Vegas.
In February, I had a chance to interview Michael Bennett on Democracy Now! And asked him about the NFL quarterback Colin Kaepernick's decision to protest against racial oppression and police brutality by kneeling on one knee during the pregame national anthem. This is what Michael Bennett said.
And I think for me personally, it just challenged me to even, join him and try to make everything in his message more make it where people understand it and they want to be a part of it, where young kids are speaking about it too. For me, the greatest thing about what he did wasn't that the adults were having a conversation about it. It was that the young people were having a conversation about it. It was the 10-year-old, 9-year-old teams, you know, they're not even getting paid in the NFL, and they're fearless. They're taking a knee. They don't even know, they understand why they're taking a knee, but at the same time, they really don't understand the magnitude of what they're doing. And then you take the middle school teams that are taking a knee, and there's not even a lot of fans in the stadium, but they're taking that knee. And you see high school people doing it, and you see college people doing it, then you see guys in the NFL doing it, and it's like, man, that started a fire. And the greatest thing was that the young kids were starting to be awoke about things that were going on and more aware. And I thought that was the coolest part about all of it. It was that the young people, the seed that he planted with the young people, it started growing, and it started growing like fire, and just started growing like weeds everywhere, and it was special. I think that, you know, he did something really special, you know, and it all started with a knee, and that's the funniest part about it. And I think it was a great thing.
So that's NFL star Michael Bennett speaking on Democracy Now! Months ago, before he was taken down by police a few weeks ago in Las Vegas. Now, Dave Zirin, here in New York a few weeks ago, 1,000 people came out in front of NFL headquarters protesting about Colin Kaepernick, that he hasn't been able to play since then. Can you talk very quickly, before we wrap up this segment, about the history of the Star-Spangled Banner being played and the players being there and this beginning resistance?
Absolutely. Like Michael Bennett says, he says we're all standing up, and it started with a knee. It started before last season with Colin Kaepernick. And what Colin did, and I think this is sometimes undervalued, is he took this knee before the anthem for 4 straight months. 16 straight weeks he did this protest. I remember speaking to John Carlos before the man who raised his fist during the '68 Olympics, and John said, wow, I just raised my fist once. Colin Kaepernick did it for 16 straight weeks. He took a knee. And I think what it did is, as Michael said, is it inspired people from middle schools to high schools to colleges, cheerleaders, soccer players, hockey players. And what it did was it expanded the discussion in uncomfortable spaces. It forced sports radio to talk about police brutality. And that's something that Michael Bennett is doing right now. It would have been so easy for him to be silent after what happened in Las Vegas, but he refused silence because he knows that he has the resources and the platform to be public and perhaps make sure that the next time Las Vegas police think about racially profiling somebody, maybe they'll think twice because of Michael Bennett.
And very quickly, have the teams always been out on the field when the Star-Spangled Banner is played? When did this start?
No, this is largely a post-9/11 phenomenon. College football players still don't come out before the national anthem. I mean, that's what's so crazy about this, is that everybody says that Michael Bennett and Colin Kaepernick, they shouldn't be mixing politics and sports, when that's all the NFL does. I mean, the reality is what the NFL doesn't want to have mix is politics. I'm sorry, they don't want resistance politics to mix with sports. When it comes to politics like militarism, they're all too happy to have that mix with sports.
Well, Dave Zirin, I want to thank you for being with us. Colin Kaepernick, his future, just briefly?
Colin Kaepernick's future will be, I don't know. I mean, it's going to take an NFL owner being very courageous, but I communicate with Colin Kaepernick, and one thing I can tell you, he just gave another $100,000 earlier this week to an organization that's fighting for DACA kids and immigrant children in this country. He's not going to stop organizing. He's not going to stop bebeing political. An NFL team should be proud to have Colin Kaepernick on their roster. If none of them can wake up and see that, he's not going to stop trying to change the world.
Dave Zirin, thanks for being with us. Sports editor for The Nation magazine, also host of Edge of Sports, working on a book with Michael Bennett about Bennett's life, Things That Make White People Uncomfortable. To see our extended interview with Michael Bennett from February, you can go to DemocracyNow.org. We'll be back in a minute. Let's Survive by Deerhoof, performing here on Democracy Now! In our studios. Their new record, Mountain Moves, is out today. To see their full performance and conversation, go to democracynow.org. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman. Hurricane Irma, the most powerful Atlantic storm ever recorded, laid waste to parts of the Caribbean overnight, pummeling Turks and Caicos, hammering the Bahamas, and taking aim at South Florida, home to millions. The storm's death toll rose to 18, but officials warn the figure will increase as rescue workers search through the rubble on islands that have seen over 90% of all buildings destroyed. Well, as Florida braces for Hurricane Irma, we now take a look at conditions in Texas prisons since Hurricane Harvey hit the Gulf Coast 2 weeks ago with a historic downpour that lasted several days and caused massive flooding. Prison officials say about 4,500 prisoners remain evacuated. This is Texas Department of Criminal Justice Executive Director Brian Collier giving an update Wednesday.
We currently still have the Ramsey 1, the Terrell, and the Stringfellow units evacuated. Those units remain largely dry. However, many of the outbuildings, support services areas appear to be wet, and we're still trying to work to get a full assessment of the damage done at those locations.
Meanwhile, prisoners were not evacuated from either the federal prison or 3 Texas prisons in the heavily flooded city of Beaumont, east of Houston, where high water was so destructive it disabled the city's water supply system. State prison officials say water did not flood prisons there, but a prisoner named Clifton Clower, who is housed on the first floor of the Stiles unit in Beaumont, told his wife he stood in water up to his kneecaps during the storm and later faced the stench of backed-up toilets. For more, we go to Texas, where we're joined in Dallas by Rachel Villalobos, who has been in touch with her husband and who's held at the Federal Correctional Complex in Beaumont. She says prisoners there faced mistreatment during flooding related to Hurricane Harvey. In Houston, we're joined by Lance Lowry, president of AFSCME Local 3807 of the Texas Correctional Employees, the union which represents Texas prison employees. Also with us, Democracy Now! Correspondent Renee Feltz, who I just left in Houston. She's back in her hometown. We welcome you all to Democracy Now! Let us begin right now with Rachel Villalobos. Can you describe when your husband called you and what he said was happening in Beaumont, in the Beaumont prison he's in, Rachel?
He called me September 2nd from prison for the first time since August 27th, and he explained the amount of food they were getting, which was 2 sandwiches a day, 8 ounces of water. He said that the prison did get water in it, that all the inmates are using the number 1 and number 2 in bags just to reserve the toilet water so they could drink the toilet water. I explained to him, don't drink the toilet water, don't drink that water in Beaumont. You know, it has bacteria and all kinds of infestations in it. And he said at this moment he didn't care. If the water didn't kill him, then the situation was going to kill him. He said he was so dehydrated that when he woke up, his eyelids were sticking to his eyeballs. His tongue was sticking to the top of his mouth. That's how severely dehydrated he was due to the lack of water.
Wait, can you explain again, what were they given in bags?
No, they were using the restroom in bags to preserve the toilet water.
And the AC, air conditioning, I mean, it is, to say the least, hot in Houston, in Beaumont, and with everything that had happened, the power had gone out, the AC was out?
Yes, they had no power. They had the generators that they were turning on and off. The AC, they didn't have no AC for a good while. The 27th was the last time I believe they had the AC. I just got a message from him saying they did have AC for 4 to 5 days. But again, I was told that the officers there are watching him and telling him what to write. So at this moment, I don't know what to believe. But that I was told from other inmates' wives that they did not have AC.
Now,
either.
there are a lot of rumors that go around at times like this, you know, in prison and outside of prison, but you got reports that 2 prisoners died from drinking the toilet water. Is that what you heard?
I have emails from inmates saying, yes, quoted, another inmate has passed already. And then at the bottom of the email, it said that this guy collapsed due to him drinking water, that the guards rushed to him. Yes, but I did get confirmation that 2 inmates from the Beaumont Low has passed away due to this.
Now, the federal officials have responded. They said there have not been any inmate fatalities as a result of Hurricane Harvey or otherwise at FCC, that's Federal Correctional Complex, Beaumont. This is TDCJ, that's the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, Executive Director Brian Collier, giving an update Wednesday on water access for prisoners in Beaumont, where the floodwaters disabled the city's water supply system.
We've had significant improvement in the last couple of days in the Beaumont area. Water pressure yesterday began improving, so as we continue this week, we see that continuing to improve, so we are getting water back in the Beaumont areas. Some of the things we did during the time the city of Beaumont was without water is our units, we have water tankers that were on site and remained filled so that we could do activities with water. We also distributed significant truckloads of water, bottled water, to those units to have offenders be able to use water. We also provided water in the housing areas of many of the facilities as well.
I want to bring Renee Feltz into this discussion, Democracy Now! Correspondent on the ground in Houston this week. Renee, can you talk about what you've been able to document on the ground about prison conditions?
Well, thanks, Amy, for having me back on. There's a lot of talk about who was evacuated during the storm and who wasn't, and the conditions. And we knew that it was important to look also at the conditions behind bars. It's a little hard to document what's happening. The Houston Chronicle has tried to visit some of the facilities in Beaumont where the city did lose water and the prisoners were not evacuated in the Texas or the federal facilities. The Chronicle wasn't allowed to receive a tour as they had requested. You know, there may be a lot going on there, and it wasn't able to be accommodated. But at the same time, journalists haven't been able to go in to see with their own eyes what's happening at the facilities. That said, it's interesting that there's an effort by the National Lawyers Guild. They have an effort called the Prisoner Legal Advocacy Network. And today, they're going to be filing a notice with the Bureau of Prisons and the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, asking them not to make sure that evidence basically is preserved in terms of documenting what's happened. So we're talking about surveillance footage, we're talking about videos inside the prison, outside, we're talking about social media images, we're talking about other records of who was moved and when, staffing records, and they're also asking people like Rachel and other loved ones and friends of prisoners in these facilities to keep track of what they've been able to document, because they plan to use some of this potentially for litigation in the future. Part of what they're concerned about is that these facilities have flooded before. In fact, we have images of a facility in the Texas area, in Texas, that has flooded previously and is now flooded again this time. I believe it's the Terrell and Stringfellow units in Rocheron, Texas. And so people have raised concerns about, if these facilities are prone to flooding, do you have a solid plan in place in terms of how to evacuate, or if you're not going to evacuate prisoners, what you're going to do to make sure that they have humane living conditions? Because what we've understood from prisoners who've been able to call out to their loved ones or to send emails, like Rachel described, is not only that some of them were describing that they did have water, even though prison officials have said that there was not water in the cells necessarily, even though there were some in outerlying buildings. There's conflicting reports of that. But we've also heard prisoners describe eating a single hot dog with no bun for lunch and having very limited access to water, as Rachel described. It's important to note, and I'd be interested to hear from Rachel about any retaliation that prisoners are facing when they do try to document conditions or to get in touch with family members. We mentioned last week when we were talking about how TDCJ, Texas Department of Criminal Justice, didn't actually get around to evacuating prisons in Fort Bend County until some people made calls to the outside, and their loved ones then called the officials and encouraged them to evacuate the facilities. We heard, for example, that Nathan Williams made a call like that and is now in one of the 45,000 prisoners that remains evacuated. One thing also, we did get an update from that prisoner, Nathan Williams, who said that they're being held in a gymnasium-like facility, sleeping on cots, and that they do have a lot of concern about cockroaches, snakes, other bugs that are bothering them.
And Renee, talk about who Nathan is.
Nathan Williams is a former death row prisoner here in Texas who was sentenced to death for a murder he says he did not commit. He was a juvenile at the time, and the U.S. Supreme Court has said that it's unconstitutional to sentence juveniles to death, and so he was moved to a different facility where he remains now. And his case is actually being reinvestigated by a special unit set up to look at cases that had evidence that ran through the Harris County crime lab, which had a lot of problems at the time.
Rachel Villalobos, that question of Renee's, was there any retaliation for your husband or others speaking out, trying to reach you? And was there trouble reaching loved ones during the storm?
There was trouble reaching him. Like I said, the last time I spoke to him was August 27th. The first time I spoke to him was September 2nd. So you could imagine me, the emotion I was at. I feel for the people that have their husbands in the shoe, their loved ones in the shoe, because they haven't heard from them, and that's really sad. There is retaliation. I got confirmation that they're retaliating on one prisoner already, and they're starting to retaliate on my husband, and that's really sad that these guards could be so corrupted like that. I mean, all we're trying to do is just help them. And for them to retaliate like that on my husband, it's sad.
I want to go to Lance Lowry. Lance is president of AFSCME Local. Local 3807, Texas Correctional Employees, represents guards and others. What are your concerns right now in hearing these descriptions?
My concerns are for our members. Our members are in the same conditions as the offenders. What I'm getting back from the feedback from the officers on the ground, they're going to tell us the truth, what's going on. There tends to be an exaggeration of some of the conditions. I'm not going to paint a rosy picture like the agency. This is a hurricane disaster zone. There has been power outages in the areas, obviously disruption of water supplies, which does create a sanitary issue. However, you know, inmates standing in 3-4 feet of water. I've visited some of these facilities, have talked personally with the officers on a confidential basis. I have not heard of any of the TDC facilities flooding inside, the ones that are currently occupied. Now, there have been issues as far as the disruption of the water supply and sanitary conditions, but the staff on the ground are in the same conditions, and they do have a vested interest pertaining to their own health to keep a sanitary environment. So,
Lance, you've told the Houston Press that the Sheriff Clark, is just doing his job by presenting a rosier picture, but have been talking about, you know, the difficulties. For example, can you talk about the Stiles unit and other prisons on emergency lockdown in Beaumont? People outside Texas might be surprised here in this one town, not that large. There are what? How many prisons? At least 5?
Yeah, there's several federal facilities, and there's 3 TDCJ state facilities in Beaumont. The conditions of the TDCJ facilities, the biggest issue, what we've seen, is staffing issues. Some of the homes, roadways were obviously shut down. One thing the agency did try to paint a rosier picture of was the staffing situation. Obviously, if you look at any of the maps from the flooding. You can clearly see that the roadways going in and out of the majority of the facilities were severely flooded. As a matter of fact, our Union Hall in Beaumont was flooded. So, you know, I've talked personally with people on the ground. It's devastation for our officers. A lot of them have experienced flooding in their own homes. And at the same time, they're trying to take care of the prisons and take care of the prisoners to the best of their abilities.
In Polk County, Florida, the Sheriff Grady Judd tweeted this week, quote, "If you go to a shelter for Irma, be advised, sworn LEOs, that's law enforcement officers, will be at every shelter checking IDs. Sex offenders, predators will not be allowed." Renee, talk about the significance of this.
Well, Amy, you mentioned Florida. A lot of people are looking at what Florida plans to do with its prison system and their prisoners. I looked this morning to see who they had evacuated, and the latest update sounds like they've got 5,000 prisoners evacuated in the last 24 hours from facilities located in the path of Hurricane Irma. And there's another 3,000 that are set to move soon. And those are early reports. That's what we're hearing from the prison officials. There's concern not just about who's going to be evacuated in terms of the prisons, but as that tweet refers to, there's concern about people with criminal records being able to access shelters and how they're being treated during all of this.
And of course, this is a separate issue, but the issue of DACA and immigrants being terrified to go into shelters, which we saw in speaking to people when we were in Houston this weekend. The number of people staying in their homes, afraid if they come out, the immigration police, as they said, the Migre would get them.
That's right. And we have also seen, Amy, when we were out at one of the neighborhoods where people were inflating their kayaks and going into their neighborhoods, we saw a Customs and Border Patrol truck full of officers that were putting on wading gear to help, as they said. But you can see how their presence in some of these neighborhoods, because of the fear about ICE and Customs and Border Patrol officials turning people in and engaging in raids and mass deportations, people are going to avoid areas where they see them because of that fear. So that's another major concern. I wanted to suggest that we get Lance to elaborate on one point, Amy, which is back here in Texas. The facilities that we've described are in areas, again, Beaumont. It's incredible. They weren't evacuated from a city that lost its water supply. And we're talking about 5 prisons. And we're talking, as Lance pointed out, not just about the prisons, but the guards. And it's been said that there are porta potties on site, for example, but groups like the Prison Abolition Prisoner Support Network, PAPS, have pointed out that 20 porta potties at a prison for a week may get a bit overused and may start to overflow. And there were concerns even whether or not the inmates themselves, the prisoners, were able to use those, or if they were just for the guards. But all of this points to a question of whether or not the facilities are meeting constitutional standards, or whether or not their prisoners during this disaster and crisis are being held in constitutional conditions or cruel and unusual conditions. And I wanted to see if Lance could speak to that point, and also about some of the history of evaluating whether the conditions at some of these facilities are constitutional.
Lance Lowry.
Sure, there's definitely some issues we need to look at as far as the facilities. So one of our main concerns is the facilities south of Houston along the Brazos River that have flooded. We're concerned about the health and safety as far as mold, black mold exposure when the agency decides to reopen these facilities. This can impact, like I said, not only the inmates, but the officers themselves. And you have to remember the officers are in these facilities for a high number of hours, and what affects the inmates as far as the health and safety does affect our officers, and that's concerning when we do have these onset of these crises. Obviously, one thing I've seen as far as a major flaw in Texas has been our staffing ratios. We don't have a high number of correctional staff available for emergencies such as this. They were lucky to get 6,000 inmates out of south of Houston where it was flood prone. Had we had more disastrous situations in Beaumont. At the time, we didn't have enough time to get people in and evacuate those offenders or even the officers. And I've been on site and have seen, and talked to, like I said, a lot of the officers. It has severely impacted our officers, and running these prison systems without the correct appropriations is leading to constitutional issues. We don't have enough staffing in place. When you don't have enough staff, services sometimes are delayed. If you look at the state of Texas as far as our staffing ratios, we manage for every officer 6 offenders. You go to the state of New York, it's 1 in 3.
Just to jump in there, Lance, as we probably need to wrap up, there's an interesting concern raised if prisoners are evacuated to other facilities and you've got those facilities managing potentially twice as many population. Many of these facilities have been had concerns raised previously about whether they're constitutional because of the lack of air conditioning in Texas, and we see that again to some of the facilities where people were evacuated to. And finally, here in Harris County, we've seen reports that the Harris County Criminal Justice Complex, a 20-story building, had its toilets explode and sewage flood everywhere after the storm. It's right next to Buffalo Bayou downtown. It could be closed for many, many months, delaying people's trials, and another aspect of the criminal justice system that we're going to keep an eye on here in Texas.
We want to thank you all for being with us. Lance Lowry, president of AFSCME Local 3807 of the Texas Correctional Employees, represents guards and others in the prisons. The union, Renee Feltz, Democracy Now! Correspondent, and Rachel Villalobos on the phone with us, who's been in touch with her husband, who's held at the Federal Correctional Complex in Beaumont, and says prisoners there face mistreatment during the flooding related to Hurricane Harvey. Beaumont lost all its water. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, the segregation of Alabama schools. Stay with us. Say That by Deerhoof, performing here at Democracy Now! Studios. To see the full performances and interview, go to democracynow.org. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. As students return to school across the country, we turn now to look at the resegregation of schools. Today, we look at Alabama. A new article in this week's New York Times Magazine, headlined "The Resegregation of Jefferson County" by Nicole Hannah-Jones, looks at how predominantly white towns in Alabama are increasingly pulling out of regional school districts and creating new schools that are overwhelmingly white. Critics say this is a new form of segregation. Well, we're joined by Nicole Hannah-Jones in our studio. Her article about choosing a school for her daughter in a segregated school system won a National Magazine Award this year. Welcome back to Democracy Now!, Nicole. So talk about what you're finding and why you chose to look at Jefferson County.
So one of the reasons that integration was so successful by court order in the South was the South tends to operate county-wide school systems, and that meant that white parents wanting to flee desegregation couldn't just simply move into a white town to get away from these orders. But what we're finding in Alabama and really across the country are white communities, wealthier white communities, wanting to pull away from these regional or county-wide school districts and form their own racially isolated, much more wealthy school districts. And that's happened in Jefferson County, Alabama. The reason I looked at that case in particular is most of the time when white communities want to, they're called school district successions, when they want to succeed from a larger school district, there's very little scrutiny, and we don't actually get to see their motivations. But the school system that this town, this suburban community called Gardendale wanted to split off from was under a desegregation order. So they actually had to go to trial, and there was discovery. And in that discovery, the racial motivations of the white people in that community became very clear. So it provided an unusual opportunity to actually explore why communities who say they want to break off for local control are often motivated by race.
That trial is fascinating that you write about, and in it, the judge actually reads from Brown versus Board of Education, especially for young people who don't even know what that is, more than half a century ago. Explain what happened then and why it applies now, and why this judge found it important to recite it in court.
So Brown v. Board of Education, of course, is the landmark Supreme Court ruling that found legally mandated school segregation unconstitutional.
Back in 1954.
Back in 1954. Prior to that, we operated under the Plessy v. Ferguson doctrine, which said segregation of black citizens was legal and constitutional as long as it was equal. Of course, it was never equal, but Brown doesn't actually deal with that. It deals with citizenship, and it's basically saying that the separation of black students from white denies them their full citizenship. The way that we kind of commonly learn this history, though, is the Supreme Court makes this ruling, and then we all agree segregation was bad and we integrate our schools, or we tried really hard. But actually what happened was there was massive resistance both in the North and the South. And it takes a very long time for school desegregation to occur, where it occurred at all, largely because of these court orders. What was so fascinating about this trial, though, is many federal judges have basically taken the position that these court orders, some of them 50 years old, have gone on too long, and that there's no more segregation for them to deal with. But Judge Madeleine Heikkila, who was appointed by President Obama, has been one of the rare federal judges who has taken these rulings very seriously. And I was reading through the court transcripts. There was just this amazing moment where she's interviewing the superintendent that the all-white school board of Gardendale appointed, and found out that he, on cross-examination, it came out that he had never hired or worked with a black teacher in his career, even though he was coming down to basically Birmingham, Alabama. And so I think she declined to be interviewed for the story, but it's clear that she calls a recess. She goes and gets copies of the Brown ruling and begins to question him about had he ever read the ruling, and then reads parts of it, particularly the parts about how segregation demeans black students aloud. And it was an amazing moment. I've written about school segregation for more than a decade. I've sat in on these trials. I've read transcripts. I've never seen a judge do that before.
And so explain what happened in Gardendale.
What's the status of the case right now? So she does this really interesting ruling. She finds that Gardendale was in fact motivated by racism, which is a very rare thing for a judge to find these days. But she kind of splits the baby. So Gardendale wanted to break off. She
to secede the school system,
yes,
which is quite amazing even to be called that.
Yeah, exactly. It's evocative of kind of all the right things, I think. She allows them in her ruling to take over 2 of the elementary schools in the town, and says she's going to watch over the case and see, how do they act basically with the black students that they have to bus in because of this court order, and if all goes well, then she would allow them to form their own district. So the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, which was fighting the secession, clearly didn't agree with that ruling. But when you read it, you see she was very conflicted about what to do with this case, understanding that if she didn't allow them to break off, it could be very soon that Jefferson County would be released from its court order and Gardendale could do whatever it wanted. And by allowing them to break off, she could put them under their own desegregation order and watch them longer. I think it really gets to the challenge of undoing racial caste in this country. It is not easily done.
I want to ask you to stay after the show so we can continue to talk about this and some of the players, and also your own pursuit of a school for your daughter, not in Alabama, but here in New York. Nicole Hannah-Jones is the award-winning reporter for the New York Times Magazine. We'll link to her piece, The Resegregation of Jefferson County. That does it for our show. Democracy Now's Juan Gonzalez is in California, Los Angeles. Check our website for his book tour. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.